Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Fall Journalism Lecture Series. We'll get started. My name is Will Yerman. I'm the Norman Eberle Professor of Professional Practice in the Donald P. Belisario College of Communications Journalism Department. I'm going to introduce our guest in just a second, just a few quick things. As always, for all of these, I'd like to thank Joe and Shirley Eberle for establishing the endowment, excuse me, for establishing the endowment that supports so many of the activities that support our students, including tonight. The endowment honors Joe's father, Norman Eberle, who graduated from Penn State in the 1920s and went on to a long career in journalism and writing. And this endowment honors his professional career. The lecture series is going to continue all semester. We have another presentation tomorrow night. Kaina Zamaria and her husband, Jean Demby, are going to talk about their careers. They are both very talented and very smart journalists. Kainaz is a visual editor at Vox, and Jean co-hosts the podcast Code Switch, so it should be a great discussion. If you are here for your first time and new to Zoom webinars, you are safe if you're wearing your pajamas. We can't see you, we can't hear you, but please add your questions into the Q&A button that's probably at the bottom of your screen, depending what device you're on, so we can listen to Tara tonight. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Pixley, is a talented photojournalist. She's a writer and professor. Her studies look and explore the problematic representation and misrepresentation of underrepresented communities in visual media. She is an assistant professor of journalism at Loyola Marymount. She has a doctorate in communications, an MFA in photography, and a BS in journalism and philosophy. So she has a lot to bring to the table tonight for her talk. Dr. Pixley is going to talk and then take questions at the end, so please drop those into the Q&A and we'll get to as many as we can. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tara. Thank you so much for being here. And yeah, we'll sit back and listen.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Well, do you want to stop sharing and then I'll be able to share my screen? Thank you. Thank you all for being here with us this evening. I'm really excited to talk through some of these ideas. I'm going to give a brief introduction to sort of my career, but let me start by sharing my screen. So I selected these first two images because you have to always start with a photo or two. But these images for me really speak to the things I love about photojournalism. And some of the first images I took early on in my career that for me framed what I wanted to do as a photojournalist and as a photographer by representing Black joy and Black normalcy, Black community, bringing those concepts to the fore and really trying to upend the sort of narrative stereotypes I'd seen. So I'll return to that, but that's where we can delve deeper into how images make meaning and why it matters how and who we depict in our photographs. I'll talk a lot about that this evening, but that is why it started here. Just to give you some background information on me, lovely array of logos here. As Professor Yerman pointed out, I have a 20-year career in photojournalism. I started actually in high school, very young, had my first image and story published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution when I was 17. And I really got into writing and copy editing at first. I wanted to be a photographer, but I didn't have access to camera technology or camera gear. And I managed to work that out, worked very hard one summer and got a camera. And then I had a staff job at the Greenville News in Greenville, South Carolina. I eventually moved on to work at Creative Loafing and Alternative News Weekly in Atlanta as an assistant photo editor, where I also received my MFA in photography at SCAD, which was a great opportunity. I got a solid foundation in how to photograph in different styles, using lights and camera equipment that I hadn't previously had access to as a pure photojournalist. And I would highly recommend that for those of you who might be considering a career in photojournalism, it's wonderful to be well versed in a variety of ways of working, excuse me, including lighting. And then I ended up working at CNN as a photo editor and wanted to get my PhD in communication at UCSD. I'm telling you all these things because they come together as I begin to talk about my work. While I was in grad school, I worked as a contract photo editor for Newsweek, and there I was able to experience the New York City media landscape, but I was also thinking about the sort of critical theory that I was learning and reading and engaging with in my doctoral program at UCSD. And that has gone on to be really important in the way that I imagine the work of the photojournalist, how I function as both a visual journalist, as a scholar of photojournalism, and an educator in journalism programs. I'm currently a freelance photographer in Los Angeles, working for a variety of news outlets, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, NPR, HuffPost, various other news and editorial organizations. I also get to do a lot of really great portrait work for magazines and commercials and nonprofit outlets. So it's fun to have an expansive interest and be hired to do a lot of different kinds of photography. I just am showing a few of my images to give a sense of the kind of photography that I like to do. You'll see a lot of portraiture. And also I shoot quite a bit of dance in my everyday life. And so hopefully this has given you a good sense of who I am and where I've come from. And I'll talk more about how the intersection of visual scholarship, visual media scholarship, photojournalism studies came together with my actual experience as a photojournalist working in the field. So I've heard some colleagues of mine saying recently that they're a human first and a photographer second. I wanted to start there because I think it's a very important and useful way to reimagine the role of the photographer. It's also interestingly drawing attention to the fact that there are those who perhaps don't have that kind of moral or ethical relationship to photography. Growing up, I always thought of journalism as a tool for democracy. I thought journalists changed the world for the better. I thought that that was a route, journalism was a route to be a world changer. And once I became a professional journalist, I realized it was a lot more complicated than that, especially within photojournalism, where often our images rely on visual tropes and implicit understandings of people and places that we build our visual stories from. Over the course of my career, I had to do as much unlearning of ways to photograph people as I did in learning how to do the work of photojournalism. And part of that is because the history of photojournalism is a complicated story. The practice of social documentary has increased awareness among the public of societal ills. It's drawn our attention to suffering and conflict such that we can begin to address those particular problems. But photography can also relegate people to stereotype. It can also tell one part of a story when we really need to understand so much more. As I came to understand the power of photojournalism to do both and either of those things, I decided that I wanted to be the kind of photographer to show how human we all are. Not in the ways in which we harm one another or destroy things, but in the ways in which we connect, build, and care despite destruction and chaos, the social or political chaos. And that's what I tend to turn my lens toward. That's often the stories that I'm hired to tell. I care about showing joy and community in general. I especially look to do that kind of visual work, photographing people of color and people from the global South. Excuse me. Historically, we've seen that approach relatively rarely in news photography, this approach of humanizing. Rather than the emphasis being on humanizing people from different backgrounds, news images often other people along lines of gender, race, or socioeconomic status, disability, etc. Things like that, that highlight difference, framing people as victims or as singularly defined by their experiences or lack, their experiences of lack, marginalization, or oppression. These ways of visualizing communities can, in my mind, only lead to audiences thinking about people photographed in those ways as victims, as the oppressed, rather than as complex fellow humans with wide-reaching experiences and lives beyond this particular story. This image that I've stopped on here is a photograph from a project I'm working on called Refugio. And I'm photographing the various refugees and asylees in Tijuana as they seek asylum in America. And my emphasis in this project is to focus on the ways in which these people are building community with one another, building community with activists and advocates, and how they're surviving and managing to thrive as best as they can, despite the very difficult and unfortunate circumstances that they are constantly struggling with. And I care about showing these kinds of images and telling that kind of story because I always want to highlight the ways in which people are in community, are caring for one another, as I mentioned. I think that that ultimately allows us to connect on a much deeper level than we do when we see people who are visualized as, again, merely oppressed. And the next thing I want to bring attention to, perhaps you might know from recent conversations and controversies in the news media industry, but photojournalism has a diversity and equity problem. While photographs that grace the pages and websites of American news media are filled with images of Black and brown bodies and people whose struggles for racial equality and civil rights are constant media fodder, those behind the images rarely share similar identities and experiences to those photographed. The same is especially true of international news visuals that emphasize the chaos and catastrophe affecting people in nations deemed underdeveloped or developing by Western capitalism standards. Between 2015 and 2018, World Press Photo worked with University of Stirling and also Reuters to produce these state of news photography reports. And what they found there was that there was this, they underscored rather, this often overlooked problem in photojournalism, the lack of equity and inclusion behind the photojournalistic camera. So these were pulled from extensive surveys of more than 1,500 news photographers from around the globe. And the reports highlighted dismal statistics like the ones I have here, that only 15% of news photographers are female typically, 65% are from North America and Europe. And hopefully you can actually read this. This graph here is showing the breakdown of the racial breakdown of photographers. And you can see there's a radically clear degree to which white or Caucasian photographers are dominating the field of news photography. So if photojournalism purports to tell the story of all humanity, the fact that we continue to view the world's entirety primarily through this white, Western, male perspective is concerning in its implications. This is the dominant point of view through which the entire world continues to see and understand itself. So I'm pulling, this information together and addressing it here so that I can discuss why diverse perspectives in photojournalism matter and how we can think about this in relation to the ethical practice of minimizing harm in photography when we're working as photojournalists. The thing I'm going to go into now is really just speaking through my experience photographing the Black Lives Matter protests, specifically in Los Angeles and in the end of May and throughout June. I photographed quite a few protests, and this one depicted here is the first one I attended. I actually wasn't planning to take pictures. I didn't even bring my sort of professional camera because I was under the impression that these protests were very violent, that if I attended, I would likely be in danger, my own bodily danger, but also I was worried that my camera gear, which I use in my profession as my livelihood, I was worried that that gear would be destroyed or stolen. And so I didn't bring my regular camera and I just kind of took snapshots. But what I observed and what I experienced was very different from that. I didn't see violence. I know I'm showing you this burned out car here, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But that was something that had happened the night before, and then it was essentially left there as this sort of photographic staging. And as you can see in this image, people were using that car as a sort of political theater for them to take images and to be photographed, to stage different things like this flag that this person, a protester, is actually setting on fire. But other than, this, again, this political theater that was intended in many ways or appeared to be intended to be photographed, the vast majority of what I saw at the protest was peaceful. And in fact, what I saw were people in community caring for each other. One of the other images I've included here is a very simple snapshot of people passing out free water, hand sanitizer, and masks. And that was something I saw very consistently across my photographing of protests in Los Angeles, that there was community care and community building taking place at all times. That was in direct contrast to the images that I was seeing that that I was discussing also with my colleagues, how my fellow photojournalists, especially photojournalists of color and women photojournalists, were saying that wasn't the experience that they were having, and yet the images that they saw in our news media and our mainstream news media continued to emphasize the protests as violent, dangerous, the protesters themselves as violent and dangerous. And so there's a couple things happening there that I would love us to sort of think through, and I hope we can talk about this more when we get to the Q&A portion. But when we're doing this work of photographing what is happening, we as photographers have the choice, of course, in what we choose to focus on, but we ultimately give up, sort of control of those images to photo editors, to the other elements in the institutions that make up news media. And when we give up that control, as we must, because especially as freelancers, if you're a staff photographer, you have a different opportunity to advocate for your own images. But as a freelancer, you often are submitting the images and hoping that they're handled with care and thoughtfulness. But often what happens in photojournalism is the lowest common denominator is, it's kind of the, if it bleeds, it leads mentality. And so when things are on fire, when bricks are being thrown or windows are being broken, if there are images of that, then that often ends up being the thing that gets published. And it's not that that isn't true. Those are, of course, real things that are happening. They are being photographed and reported on. But if you are a photographer who spent 4 hours at a protest and it was completely peaceful that whole time, and then in the last 20 minutes, a fight breaks out, and you photograph that as well, because of course that's happening in front of you. It's the reality. You should photograph it. But then you turn in 3 hours of peaceful imagery that highlight the shared humanity, all of these things. And then you have a few images of things being broken or, aggressions, what have you, and that gets published, then it gives the audience the wrong impression. It gives even though the reporting on the ground itself was accurate and truthful and possibly even holistic, the publication process becomes a thing that allows for a misunderstanding, a misrepresentation. And I think that part of what we need to do as photojournalists is recognize the possibility of that happening and really strive to make clear our lived experience on the ground. We can make that clear in a lot of different ways. I tend to write very lengthy and intense captions to clarify things like that. But more than anything, I emphasize in my image making these moments of intimacy and connectivity. And certainly as I was photographing the protests, the recent protests over the summer and the ongoing racial justice movement, I continue to think about what sort of meaning my images are making in the world. What does it say beyond what I see happening, and how can I actually counteract any potential misunderstandings of that? For example, in this image I'm showing here, this was a mother and her daughter. I know that because I stopped and spoke to them. And this woman was actually leading chants. And this image doesn't showcase that. I don't have her face turned toward the camera. I'm not, depicting her with her mouth wide open, yelling those chants that would give more of an understanding perhaps of that being what's happening. But part of why I chose this photo, and I think this photo has resonated a lot with people because I've gotten many requests to publish this particular image, it shows the relationship of youth and childhood and the hope we have for Black children in indirect relationship to the National Guard people, the protesters themselves, and what it means to actually amplify Black voices and have Black lives matter. So there's a visual narrative developing in this image, and part of the image here is, or part of the reality of what was happening is lost, the part that has this woman as the leader of the chants. And also you can't see that where I'm standing, beside me and behind me, there are hundreds of people amassed. So this is only a small, just a tiny sliver of the truth of this day and what was happening even in this exact moment. And that's all we can ever offer as photojournalists, is just a small portion of the truth of the reality of our experience and of the experiences of the people who are there. But I think it matters a lot to take into consideration, to remain very critical and engaged with how our photographs make meaning, how they will be potentially interpreted, and to try and constantly check ourselves and make sure that the stories that we're telling with our images, with our visual representation of reality, is not only accurate as possible, but that it's also not falling into telling stories that we don't intend to. It's not relying on sort of visual tropes and things like that. And to go back to the earlier image, this one here, this is the reason why I'm interested in this photo and why I would show it at all, is just as to exemplify sort of my thought process in making photos of the protest. This was the very first protest I attended, and I watched as this person walked up to this flag and started to set it on fire. And I thought, of course, I'm a journalist, I thought, wow, this is a excellent visual symbol. And as I was thinking that, I also was thinking, if I photograph this person in some way that identifies them, then I could potentially get them in trouble. They could, even though it's not illegal to burn flags, which I learned actually around this time, it could still put this person in danger from various alt-right groups or fascist militias if they were recognized. It could be doxxed. So I'm thinking about those things as I take images as well. I'm also noticing, as you can see in this photo, part of why I took it this way is to show how many other people were there photographing, and how this sort of a tableau, that political theater, again, is being negotiated by my own presence as a photographer and by these other people taking pictures with their phones, and how those images might get circulated. So I don't have a great answer. I think that it's a personal choice to consider how your images, how the photographs that you're taking in moments like this, how they might negatively or positively impact people in your images. But that's part of why I would emphasize this ethic of minimizing harm, of thinking about your relationship to the people in the photographs and their relationship to you and your camera and the photos that will ultimately circulate of them. And a lot of the other things I was looking for in photographing the protest was just sort of seeing how the environment itself created story. I didn't know this at the time when I took this photo, but I later found out that this is a piece, an installation artwork piece by, oh gosh, I think her name is Barbara Kruger. I'm blanking a little bit on that, but an artist whose work I greatly enjoy, and it just worked really perfectly for me. I was kind of walking by as part of the protesters who were walking through Hollywood, and I saw this moment, and it spoke to me of what policing is in America. So I'm creating a narrative here, even though I'm not, I'm not asking these police officers to stand here in this way, but I'm identifying this moment in which to make an image that speaks to my understanding of the protests, of the racial justice movement, of the sense that the American people are having around what policing means and what it actually entails, and what sorts of structures of power we're engaging in by supporting police, and what sorts of structures of power protesters are speaking back against. So I showed this photo to call attention to how we can build narrative with our images without taking away from our journalistic approach to creating honest and accurate visuals, but always thinking about the meaning made in our photographs. So some of the things I noticed also especially at this particular protest, was that many of the photographers in attendance, they were often not wearing masks. They were doing things like smoking in the middle of a crowd where there were children. They were running up to people to photograph them and then walking away, surrounding people during these choice visual moments, and then leaving without actually engaging in any kind of conversation. And I want to bring attention to those behaviors because I think for three reasons. One, I think it's very important for us to be respectful when we're in spaces as photojournalists. We need to think about who we represent, what we represent as members of news media, and how we want to build trust and the sense that we're doing an important public service. And we can't do that work if we're disrespecting important things like people's health and safety by not wearing masks. We can't do that work if we aren't respecting people's respecting people's stories and while we have a right to photograph in public spaces and they have a right to be there protesting in those public spaces, and we're sharing that public space and those collective rights, we're unified through those rights. We also have a responsibility to be engaged with the people we're photographing. And beyond that responsibility, beyond those rights, good journalism requires that you speak to the people that whose stories you're telling. Good photojournalism requires that you have those thorough and informed captions. And so you might be familiar with conversations around informed consent that have become controversial in the photojournalism community, specifically in recent months. And I'm a huge proponent of informed consent because I think that it is already written into our practice as photojournalists. Every one of these images that you see here, I confirmed with the person I was photographing that they were okay being photographed. That doesn't mean that I always was able to walk up to them and get their name and do all of this work. But whenever I was photographing someone whose face was readily visible or who might be identifiable, I would connect with them, make sure we caught eyes, get a head nod, point at my camera. Little things like that made it possible for me, even in spaces of thousands of people, or hundreds to thousands of people, it made it possible for me to do the job that I feel is the most ethical way of working as a photojournalist. And that really matters to me so that I can minimize the potential harm. There were only 2 people. I photographed 7 to 10 protests over that month. And in all of that time, of the hundreds and hundreds of people I photographed, there was only 2 people who asked me not to show their face or who asked not to be photographed. So it's not a difficult thing to include this work of informed consent or minimizing harm as we go about our practice of documenting history, of documenting the most important stories of our time. This is another good example of some behaviors that I saw that I was deeply disappointed by. This was a moment where all of these people on the front line can kind of see that they're hugging, they're in this moment of solidarity, and many of the photographers in the crowd rushed towards this moment. I actually came in towards the end of the moment. I meant to include the reverse shot of this because I'd taken a photo right before this one where I photographed all of the photographers who were kind of encroaching on these girls' space. They were crying and holding hands and hugging each other and praying together, which of course is a very powerful visual moment. And I certainly would never say that you should forego powerful visual moments. However, there were at least a dozen photographers who photographed that moment of intimacy and connectivity. And I was the only person who I saw anyway, who came and spoke to these 2 people in this photo. So although they were surrounded by photographers and many, I'm sure, got very incredible images, they didn't do that next step of actually talking to you. I wanted to know what they were crying about. What were they praying about? What was happening? And I think that's part of the job that we do as photojournalists, is not just to snap images that depict a poignant moment, but to dig into what that moment means and to try and clarify that moment for our audiences, to make it evident to improve the impact of those poignant moments by helping people connect on a deeper level with the people in their images. And I'll just kind of roll through these last few photos, a lot of the work that I ended up doing during my time photographing these protests was just trying to convey my experience. I am a Black Jamaican American. So I identify in many ways with, of course, I identify with the concept of Black Lives Mattering. I'm also a mother of 2 children. My son is 14 years old, and he too is a Black person in America. And so as I go about this work as a photojournalist, I am not pretending this level of objectivity, this idea of neutrality that we can never actually reach, and that level of neutrality that actually makes it harder for us to do our job well, because part of being a journalist is recognizing all of the different aspects of a story and trying to convey all of that information to your audience. If I'm pretending as a photojournalist that I'm being neutral and objective, then I actually can't see every aspect of this, because I'm ignoring my own personal biases, my implicit biases. I'm ignoring my lived experience and what all of that brings to the images that I'm making. However, if I acknowledge that those things are real, that every human alive has implicit biases, that we all have experiences that make us who we are, if I recognize those things, I acknowledge it, and I'm willing to critically engage what that means in the work that I'm doing, then I can tell more accurate, more compelling stories, because I'm accounting for that potential for bias. I'm accounting for that potential for me to not understand or to have missed something. And I'm also accounting for my knowledge, how my lived experience translates to knowledge. I can connect with the experiences of the people in my images because I've also lived this life. I know what it is to be aggressed by police or by these sort of systems of power that use racism to enact power against communities and individuals. And so I think that this work of minimizing harm, of being an ethical photojournalist, it requires that we engage with our image making in a way that we perhaps were not, or I certainly wasn't taught during my time in J school. It requires us to acknowledge shared humanity between ourselves and the people that we're photographing, so that we can make that connection evident in the photos that we're making for our audience. We want our audience to be able to connect with what's happening on the ground, and we have to actually be able to do that ourselves. So acknowledging the ways in which we're different and the same, or how we might be having similar experiences, or perhaps you're a person who came from a very privileged background and you never had to think about these things. That's okay. That is a perspective that is valuable and can be important in photographing the world. But you have to also recognize that that is true, that is going to impact your relationship to and understanding of the people that you're photographing. So as I went about my sort of practice or my work around photographing the protests, I tried to kind of find these moments that I thought were either quirky or that for me were different than the photos I was often seeing typically published in our mainstream media, which I also work for. So I don't mean to make some sort of false dichotomy between myself and mainstream media. I am a media maker, and I do work for those major news organizations. But I can also love news media and believe wholeheartedly in journalism and critique it as well, because that is, critique is a labor of love. It is caring enough about something and valuing it enough to try to identify how it could be better. And that is my relationship to photojournalism. And images like this, I kept looking for ways to capture the relationship of protesters to photographers, and how much of this movement was being interpreted through the visual, how we were sort of playing with one another in many different ways. And I saw that relationship coming out quite a bit as I photographed, in the way that people reacted to me, but I also was witnessing the way people were reacting to or were sort of playing up to cameras or trying to avoid them in different ways. and so I think that there's some really interesting social work, like being socio-political work happening in these protests. And it's perhaps one of the Black Lives Matter movement over the years has grown to be one of the most photographed and most sort of engaged in the digital of any movement of, in recent memory in America anyway. And so what does it mean to be a part of this movement that is partially happening online, partially happening in a digital space, and it's partially a war of visuals and images and context, both from citizen journalists, from people photographing and filming and posting online, and professional journalists and how they're photographing and posting and filming and reporting. And another thing, I really love this this free PB&J sandwiches thing, because so many of the signs that I experienced were they were either humorous, like the "I bite racist" image here with this dog, or it was people. Every protest I went to, there were more and more ways in which people were finding to be of service. The first protest, it was masks and water being given out. Then I would see that just times multiplying. There were far more people who were doing it. And then this protest, I saw people giving out food, plenty of food being given away, people just really going to great lengths to take care of one another and to recognize the kind of difficulty of being in a global pandemic, but also wanting to do this work, this socio-political work of fighting for justice, being in solidarity, while also being sort of conscious of the health and safety precautions one might need to take. So trying to kind of identify that in my images was really important to me. And the last protest I will speak about tonight was the All Black Lives Matter protest, which happened in West Hollywood on June 14th. And this one was really interesting. It was the intersection of Pride, which was ostensibly canceled in light of the global pandemic, of course, in light of COVID, but the organizers of Pride here in LA decided that they wanted to honor what was happening with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so they decided to do this combined protest. So they encouraged, queer LGBTQ solidarity with Black Lives Matter, and it drew, I think, almost 100,000 people to West Hollywood. And we marched through, or the protest went through several miles of streets. And this was the most, I would say, celebratory of all of the protests that I went to. There was very little police presence that I could see at all along the protest route. And it was so interesting because there were people who were dancing and laughing. There was music being played from trucks, DJs performing on these moving vehicles. And it was a very different vibe. It felt like the sort of sense of liberation versus the emphasis on oppression and anger that I had felt in the first few protests. And so that is what I wanted to capture, was that sense of play. And it was very clear that people were, tired of being inside, tired of being disconnected from one another. And as you can see in these images, not everyone was wearing masks, so that there was certainly a lot of that. But what I wanted to capture was that sense of, that jovial sense, that sense of both being in solidarity and community, but being in celebration of what it means to be Black, or what it means to be, in the LGBTQ community, and how one can take pride in any of those things. That was the sense I was getting from the way that people were responding and reacting to one another in that space, and reacting to the space itself. And so that is what I turned my camera towards. I do feel that there has been a sort of ongoing effort to make Black Lives Matter protests be solely about oppression, because that's the framework and understanding that many photojournalists and news institutions have about Blackness and Black community. If you only ever imagine people as victims and the oppressed, then you don't feel the need to respect those people. You don't talk to them and engage their experiences. You don't give them the respect of knowing where their photos might end up, or, you know, kind of what you're doing in photographing them. If you can only imagine people of color or poor people or queer people in relation to your own experiences as a person with privilege, or, you know, a person who is not a person of color, then you miss important parts of the story and you fail to produce the level of quality journalism you could or should be doing. And I don't say this to imply that I am in any way doing, you know, photojournalism the right way or the best way or anything like that. My visual take on these events is just that it is a singular visual take. It is one perspective. And what matters is that we have a lot of different perspectives. What matters is that we engage the power and privilege of our position as photojournalists, and that we recognize the power and privilege we have, so that we can think about minimizing harm as we go about photographing marginalized or vulnerable communities. Our audiences and our public, everyone, all of us deserve to see the world in its myriad, complicated existences and realities. And we can't do that if we're operating from that singular perspective that I talked about earlier. We can't do that if we are failing to get the whole story because we're not engaging the people we're photographing as holistic beings with complicated lives that deserve to be photographed in their entirety. So to conclude, I just want to reiterate a few things that I think are extremely important to having an ethical approach to image making. Never rely on stereotypes to convey meaning. Too often we see these simplistic othering portraits of blank-faced people of color as the de facto image to sort of illustrate a human rights issue. Merely portraying expressionless faces in far-flung places does not make an impact, nor do images of horrific and graphic violence inspire lasting and change-making empathy. Neither of these kinds of photographs move forward an understanding of what's being done to address problems. They rely on racist and imperialist visual tropes and problematic ways of depicting Black and brown people and the majority world, to borrow Shahidul Alam's term. And be better and smarter than that. That's what I want for us. I want us to upend those tired old ways of visualizing and imagining the world. And I think we should make every effort to expand existing visual narratives, because a holistic and thorough engagement with the individuals, communities, and environments that we cover produces the kind of knowledge on issues that motivates action in audiences. In order to tell those stories accurately and truthfully, we need to move beyond visualizing the victimization of particular individuals or communities. We should begin by understanding people we portray as individuals and social ecosystems whose experiences and practices may work in ways unfamiliar to us. Exemplary journalism highlights the commonalities between human struggles. When I see truly exceptional journalism, it's because that person is working in a way that recognizes shared humanity and puts that sentiment at the core of their images. So I'll end on this quote from Bell Hooks, one of my favorite scholars. Not only will I stare, I want my look to change reality. And what I interpret that to mean is that the act of looking is its own power. And we can't pretend that we are neutral observers, because our mere presence, the act of photographing, of picking up a camera and making a choice, of composing an image, a frame, and then publishing those images, you know, having the power and the reach and the access to these spaces, and then the reach to publish your interpretation of these spaces to global audiences or national audiences. That is an extreme power and privilege. And so that work is not neutral. That work is not objective. It is itself power. And so what kind of power do you want to have over the world? What sort of impact do you want that privilege that you have, that power that you have as a photojournalist? What impact do you want that to have? And if you can acknowledge that your look is changing reality, do you want to change it for the better? And I will end on that note. I look forward to hearing your questions.
Oops, just getting my stuff going here. That was wonderful, thank you. And it raised lots of questions for me, but we already have a few questions in the room, so I'll maybe go to those first and then circle back and use my privilege as the co-host. The first one was just a fact question, was the percentage for, well, the question is, what was the percentage for new women photographers? But I think your slide was news women photographers, and I thought it was 15%, but do you remember what the percent breakdown was in the slide?
For news women, for women photographers in news, yes, it was 15%.
Okay, that's what I thought. I'm not sure if I think that was what the question was, but if not, the person can submit it again.
Well, a good, an interesting tidbit is I'm currently working with a team of other researchers and scholars of visual journalism, and we're producing the latest survey that will result in the State of News Photography 2020. So we'll have new statistics that hopefully are better. Hopefully we'll see some change since 2015 when they first did that survey and first started seeing those statistics.
Can you leak any numbers to us yet? Do you have any data to share?
Well, I don't have data to share because we're still producing the survey. I've actually done my own surveys that was part of my dissertation that hasn't been published anywhere yet. And there are some interesting things there, but I will tell you from a forthcoming article that I have on, I did a content analysis of Photojournalism Awards, so specifically the World Press Photo and Photographer of the Year International. And no, in the two categories that I was looking at, so there are many categories, but the two specific ones I looked at, over 20 years, not a single Black photographer has won the award. And so that is a telling statistic. Also, not a single Indigenous photographer. So that research will be coming out soon, and it is unfortunate the statistics there, but I have high hopes that we'll be moving away from those kinds of statistics soon.
That's stunning. Not totally surprising for World Press, but still pretty stunning. Excuse me. So a couple of the questions that came in, Kurt Chandler, one of our faculty, asks, do you seek out particular editors who are most likely to be receptive to your visual reporting, or do you spend a lot of time trying to enlighten editors to not go for the easy sort of bang bang shot?
That's a great question. I would not pretend that I'm in the sort of position in my career where I can say no to certain editors. I will say that there is certainly a whisper network among colleagues who have this sort of ethical and critical relationship to image making, that we do share information about photo editors or news organizations that we think are particularly toxic or not as engaged in this sort of critical thinking about our work as photojournalism. So I haven't personally had to, say no thank you to a photo editor like that. I've had the absolute wonderful experience and privilege of working with really great photo editors. And I don't turn in a single photo that I don't want to see in print. That is how I work as a photographer. And if this has rarely ever happened, but if a photo editor ever does ask for my entire take, because sometimes I'll photograph things that later I'm looking at it and saying, oh, I don't, that's not great in terms of what, what it's saying in the images, not just the quality of the photos, but I would certainly tell those people, here's my entire take, but I would really prefer if you don't go with these photos for these reasons. And a lot of times it's about communicating what you experienced on the ground, because a photo editor has no idea what happened. They're looking at your photos. They can only interpret from the information you give them. So being as forthcoming and clear about what actually happened, that example I gave earlier of a 4-hour protest you cover in the last 15 minutes, there's a fight, then that's a thing you should say to the photo editor. I'd really like it if you didn't, maybe this is a tertiary, like a secondary or tertiary image, but the main photo that you go with should actually highlight the first 3 hours and 45 minutes of that protest, which was entirely peaceful, and that was the real story. I think those are the conversations that we have to have and we should be having.
It does seem like the one place in the process where the photographer has some influence is just simply not to give photos that they don't want to see published. Would it be your inclination then, if based on your observations, that fight or act of violence was just such a small part of the protest, to not even give them that option unless they asked for it? Even though other photographers, they're obviously going to be seeing that work maybe in other.
Yeah, I would definitely give that option, because I I'm a professional. I want to be respected for the work that I do. And I wouldn't want a photo editor to think, oh, well, why didn't Tara get this? She was there. So I would certainly give them the images, but I would just draw attention to the fact that it was a minor aspect of the protests from my experience of my time there. And, and then it's out of my hands. Some things you have to, you have to recognize your role and do the best that you can to combat stereotyping and things like that. But ultimately, news media is an institution and it functions in a particular way. And so this is why I both study it and work in it. And I think there are ways to intervene in those like old modes of working that I think are outmoded, and that I hope we're kind of working to get past. But they are still very much a reality, and I think that we just we can acknowledge those things, try to intervene, and then keep thinking about the next opportunity to do better.
Fair enough. Another question from Kurt. Going forward, how would you ideally construct visual coverage of the Black Lives Matter movement? Who would you send? What stories would you like them to explore if you were king of the visual world for a day?
Oh, to be king of the visual world for a day or more. I would really like to see, I've seen people doing portrait series with quotes, and I think that that's compelling. There's certainly, beautiful portraits I've seen. Stephanie Mei-Ling did a story like that for High Country News, and they're gorgeous portraits. But I would really like to see more engagement with what is happening now. What are people fighting for now? A thing that I noticed was that towards the end, one of the last protests that I photographed was actually a portrait series I was doing for AARP magazine of older people at protests. That was really an interesting and fun experience. And whereas before, the protests had just kind of been, while they were organized, they weren't asking for a particular thing. It was kind of like defund the police, or it was a sort of amorphous protest situation. But then protests became more pointed and asking for specific things. And I know that from being in LA and hearing, I have many friends who are activists or advocates or who are just very politically engaged. And so they're telling me about the protests that they're going to and the information they have about them. So I know that people are being very targeted towards specific causes. And one of the protests that I went to when I was photographing for AARP was to defund school police. And this was something I didn't realize, even though my children are in LA Unified School District here. I didn't realize that there's millions and millions of dollars that is a separate budget just for LAPD in Los Angeles schools. So there's, the I don't know what it is, $50-75 million budget for LAPD. And then there was, I don't hesitate to make up numbers, but several millions of dollars just for school police. And the protests that I actually attended, there were only maybe 50 to 100 people there. It was pretty small, but they'd been going to this protest every week to protest outside of the school board meetings. And they successfully got them to cut the school police fund by, I think, 25 or 35%, which was a huge win. Or, if you imagine this, it's a win in terms of protesting for something and then receiving that thing that you're asking for. So I would love to see photo stories around these kinds of interventions. I would also love to see the sort of inner workings of Black Lives Matter, because there's this whole thing happening that is, similar to what we saw during the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, where that was imagined as or certainly, represented historically as individuals, but it was actually a network of activists across the country who were working together. And so that is definitely happening with Black Lives Matter, but I don't see a sort of visualization of that process. What are the BLM meetings like? What are they talking about? Who are those people? Who are, who are the leaders of this, and and how is that working? I feel like what we see now is just sort of like, oh, fires and bricks and marches, and there's lots of people, and that's all very interesting and valid, but there's so much more happening here, and I'm not seeing those stories. So I would really like to dig into the networks of activism and be able to tell compelling stories to the public about how this is happening, and that also leads to the why. Why it matters, why people are putting this amount of effort into this work, this activist work.
Do you think that, I mean, in some ways, ultimately covering the protests themselves isn't the story? I mean, obviously the protests are a story and need to be covered, but that the underlying issues that have led people to want to protest are not getting, they don't get told because we spend so much energy covering the actual protests. So we're not covering issues of, education and poverty and disenfranchising and all of that.
Absolutely. I think the way that we see American news media covering these Black Lives Matter protests, yeah, and really from its inception in Ferguson and after Trayvon Martin's killing, um, it's always been this sort of, oh, look at these people being randomly angry, and they're so angry randomly. That's how it's represented, as if it came out of nowhere rather than coming from a centuries long relationship to oppression and enslavement and all of these other very bad things. And this is an opportunity for us as journalists, for news media as an institution, to recognize the ways in which we have failed at telling this story, the complexity of race in America, and how redlining determines who gets to have generational wealth. Because if you couldn't buy homes in places where homes accrued interest, or accrued wealth, then you now have lost out on generations of wealth. That's a really basic concept, but something that people have really no idea, because it isn't written into the stories that we're telling about about why protests are happening. So I think you're absolutely right to point out that there's this missing context, and I think that that's partially because many of the journalists, as I was saying before, they don't understand it. It's not their lived experience. Their families were able to build generational wealth. They haven't been stopped at gunpoint by police officers. And so to them, it seems, perhaps not as important. It's not life or death. And so it gets reported on as just the next thing that's happening, rather than perhaps the most important story or in this country anyway, of our time. So yes, there's plenty of work to be done there.
I wanted to, well, actually, let me take, there's a question someone has just, I'm assuming from a student. What's the best advice you would give an up and coming photojournalist?
I was actually I keep getting this question in the last couple of weeks, and my answer is the same for everyone. Get a therapist. Get a therapist early, be very consistent, go to therapy. Everyone needs it, but especially journalists, because frankly, you're going to see so many things that, if you have the privilege of becoming a professional photojournalist, a good portion of your life might be, mayoral press conferences and whatever parades. But I think we all at some point are in proximity to very deep suffering. And while, I keep returning to the terms of power and privilege, while it is absolutely a privilege that I never lose sight of how honored I am to be able to tell these stories, it can be very hard, and it's emotionally exhausting. Even the best of even a day where I'm hanging out with cool people and getting to photograph them and be a part of their lives, that takes so much energy and so much sort of like cognitive shifting. And if you're having a bad day, it doesn't matter. You have to show up and be on and be very present. You have to talk to people you don't like. You have to talk to people who you deeply disagree with or even think are the scourge of the universe. And you have to be respectful and professional to them. And that can be emotionally exhausting. So there's just so many different components to this job that are simultaneously wonderful and difficult. And that's why therapy is great. but also I would say of equal importance, and I ask this of all of my students and my colleagues: read far and wide, read expansively, open your mind to all sorts of thinking, and read critical theory. It's not, when you pick up a camera, you're doing so much more than just operating a technical, than operating a technology and applying some sort of technical skill. You are writing history. You are performing centuries of understanding of particular things, whether you know it or not. And so it behooves you, and it is your responsibility to understand what work you're actually doing when you pick up a camera. And you're not going to do that without reading and becoming a very critical engager in socio-political philosophy and understanding. I'm not saying that, like, read Marx, it's the end all be all by any means. I'm not a huge Marx person, but be very engaged in a variety of ways of thinking about our world. I read cognitive psychology, I read child psychology, I read biological papers, because so much of that stuff actually comes into my work, and it always helps me. I've never read anything and thought, well, I'll never use that again. It comes up always. So really encourage that kind of engagement with critical understandings of the world.
There we go. Thank you. That was great. There's a couple of questions, but I wanted to at least talk a little bit about the article you wrote and the sort of the controversy that it sort of raised in the photojournalism community, at least with some people, and the idea of informed consent. I wonder if you could first, the story you led with about the photographer coming up to take that picture, if you could tell that story, because you'll do it better than I can. And then maybe just sort of outline your position and why you think it raised such controversy.
Well, I will start by saying I don't believe that the article that I wrote started the controversy. I actually wrote the article partially in response to the controversy. So it certainly pre-existed my writing of the article. And thank you for that prompt, because I'd meant to talk about that situation that thing I experienced. So I photographed all but one of these protests alone, but as I started to notice that the protests were becoming less and less, I never saw any violence, but they definitely felt like they had the capacity for violence. There was a palpable sense of rage and sort of anticipatory energy that made me, while I was not afraid for myself, I didn't want to bring my children. And then that started to dissipate over the weeks. And so towards the end of June, I thought, I'll take my daughter. I want her to, kind of see what's going on in the world and be engaged in, also we've just been inside for months and months quarantine. So I took her to a protest, and we were also there with my my partner, who is a white woman, and that matters in this story. So my partner was there so that I could photograph and kind of, go and do my thing, and she could watch out for my daughter, Bryn. And at a certain point, I was off sort of taking photos, and my partner had my daughter on her shoulders, and my daughter's a 10-year-old girl. She's very noticeably Black. And I looked over and actually noticed that was this kind of interesting moment. It's certainly, I said, don't play on visual tropes, but there's certainly a visual story there of this white woman carrying a young Black girl at this Black Lives Matter protest. And so I understood the draw of that visual, that potential visual. And this man, as I'm turning to kind of start to go towards them and photograph them, this man runs directly in front of me, and he didn't shove me. It was very much, he just didn't notice me. It was like I just was not relevant to his life at all. And so he stepped right in front of me and took several images of my daughter and my partner. He was about 6, maybe at most 10 feet from them. No, probably about 10 feet. And took several photos and then walked away. So I witnessed all of this happening. I'm still sort of beating myself up for not taking a photo of this moment. I took a photo of them afterwards, but I didn't capture the photographer in the shot. And when I went, and I immediately went over to my partner and I asked her, did he catch eyes with you, or like, did he even gesture to his camera? Did he do anything that indicated he was, seeking your acknowledgement that he was photographing you? And she said, no, he just took a bunch of shots and left. And so I opened my article for the Neiman Reports with this moment, because I thought it was very telling of the ways in which photojournalists can engage in toxic behavior in public spaces. And actually that was not the first time, it was not the last time, it was not the only time that I was pushed out of the way, or that other photographers stepped in front of me. And I have to say, I'm not, when I say this, I do not at all imply that this is true of all male photographers or all white male journalists, but every single one of those times it was a white male photographer. I don't know whether they were professional or not. I didn't stick around to ask them questions. But it did become clear that me as a Black woman in those spaces was not read, even though, I have, even if I'm walking around with my 5D Mark IV, even if I am photographing with Canon L glass, which is, thousands of dollars, and typically the sort of coin of the realm in photojournalism, none of that mattered, because to them I was like just clearly a non-entity. And so having had that experience over the years, as I've worked as a photojournalist, it doesn't necessarily faze me anymore. But if I'm being treated that way, and I'm a professional photographer who is there in professional capacity, you can only imagine how the protesters themselves are being treated, and I have some modicum of power. I was also wearing a press badge. So there's all of these different things that are happening that really speaks to the problematic ways in which some photographers engage in public spaces. And it's not just the protests. This happens in many different places and spaces.
But so the argument of your article, or you made several sort of arguments about what was wrong with that kind of behavior, and how journalists should be interacting and treating the people that they're photographing. But why was that controversial? Like, it doesn't seem very controversial to say you should treat people with respect, right?
Okay. Sorry, I forgot about the second part of the question. So
That's right.
what I was arguing for in that article, and what I had been arguing for before, is informed consent, is minimizing harm. The same thing I was talking about in my talk earlier. And the controversy there is that people are, quite intentionally refusing to engage, to hold two ideas in their head at one time. We have a right to photograph in public, ensconced in the First Amendment. We have, like I said, that the people have a right to a freedom to assemble and to, protest, and we have a right to photograph and report in public. But we also have a responsibility to not be jerks, to be conscientious, to wield that right with care and consideration. And the controversy that sort of erupted in photojournalism was very clearly, there's this one sector of photojournalism that are more traditional, we'll say. They've been in the industry longer, and they've been doing it this way for a while. And those people were never asked to read critical theory. Many of them didn't go to school, and I don't say that in any sort of like elitist way to say that they're not as good because they didn't go to school. It just, they went immediately into doing their job, and they do photojournalism really, really well, and they're incredible photographers. They're respected all around the world, but they never had to do this work of like reading extensively, as I said. And I'm generalizing here. Of course, I don't know with absolute certainty whether or not all of these people did this, but the way that they speak implies that they are not well versed in a critical engagement with the work that they are doing, with the meaning that they're making in their images. And they are antagonistic to the idea that we have a responsibility to our public. And I think it was pretty apparent that the like younger generations, emerging photographers, photojournalists, people of color, women, those seem to be the spaces in the industry that were very amenable to the idea that we have a responsibility to the people we photograph. And I really do think it comes down to that. And I understand this fear of losing our right and, taking for granted our First Amendment, because journalists are being pressured and attacked and targeted and killed, and it's scary right now to be a journalist. So any sort of incursion on your rights as the right of a free press feels like a danger. I do get that, but I actually think that the opposite is true, that we are partially endangered because we don't engage the public in understanding what it is we're doing, that we don't respect the public in the way that they need to be respected so that they can feel good about the work we're doing. And I think if we take more time and care with our public, with our audiences, with the people we're photographing, they'll trust us more, they'll protect us more, we'll be in less danger, because there will be this understanding of the value of the work that we do. But as long as we continue to devalue the people in our images, they will devalue our work. And it's a cyclical relationship. So yes, I understand where it came from. I get the controversy at its core, a right versus a responsibility, but I think that you can actually retain and maintain both, and it doesn't have to be controversial.
Yeah. So I did read, I've read some of the, excuse me, back and forth. And I mean, certainly there have been some thoughtful responses from people who disagree with your position, but I'm sort of curious. The photographer who butts in front of you and doesn't acknowledge the person they're photographing and doesn't make an effort to get the names of, turns out to be your daughter and your partner, but like, there's no excuse for that. That's just bad journalism. But that seems like a different question than informed consent and this question of where does the right of the journalist to document what's happening versus the right of the person to protect themselves. And I see the complication of the question, but they seem different. Like, I don't think anyone is defending a jerk, right? I mean, I hope.
Some people are definitely defending jerks.
Maybe some people are, right? Oh, that's probably true. But it starts to feel problematic for me when we get into this place where the permission is all on the subject. Because then I think our own as you said, we all come in with our own points of view and biases, but are you going to give the same respect to someone you disagree with? Are you only going to give informed consent to people who you feel need your protection? And then it becomes a question. I think the other thing that is striking to me is that you assume a lot when you assume that people need your protection. I mean, if someone actively comes up to me and says, please don't take my picture, I'm inclined to go along with that unless there's some overriding, justification for that photo. But yeah, I mean, I'll let you I don't know quite where I'm going with the question.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and it's a very valid question and one that many people have had. The thing that it comes down to, first, it's not about permission. For me, I'm not asking permission. I don't need permission. I am offering informed consent because I respect this person's right to know where their photo might end up. That's why it's about, the informed part is like what really matters to me. And this is complicated because, as I said, I can't always, and I don't always engage in a lengthy conversation with someone. I know when I'm taking the photo, and also I take the photo first and then go and talk to them. If someone is doing an interesting thing, I'm not going to ruin that moment by saying, oh, well, let me ask them first. No, I take the photo and then I say, hi, I got a photo of you. I'm working with the New York Times. I'm photographing for this reason. It might be here. It might not get published, or, or whatever. Sometimes I was photographing just for my own, edification and possibly to license the images later. And I would say that too, and say, I'm a professional photojournalist. I'm not working on assignment right now, but I'll likely put these on my Instagram account. Here, you can have my Instagram handle. You can check it out. I'll send them to you if you'd like. And, you know, they might end up in an actual publication. What I found is that people just, you know, just having that conversation with people seem to put them at ease that I'm not a jerk, you know, that I wouldn't take advantage of them. But all of that to say, it's not always possible to have that conversation. So, you know, as you can see my images, sometimes there's like 50 people, and it's not just, I can't do that for all the people in my photo. What I can do is that kind of, you know, eye contact for the people that I know are the main focus of my image, or who are very visible and evident. And after all of that, the thing that really, really matters is power. I don't assume anyone needs my protection, but I do understand, or I try to understand, the different flows of power in any situation. Like I'd said earlier, you know, a protester who's standing there holding a sign, there's nothing in my image that is going to criminalize them. They haven't done anything wrong. A protester who is lighting a flag on fire or walking on a car is in this gray area where they could be criminalized. I've said this, I don't think I said this during this talk, but I've said it previously. I chose not to photograph after curfew because I knew that any images I took that had a timestamp after Los Angeles's curfew, anyone who was in that photo could be criminalized, could be arrested, could be found later and arrested. So those are the things that I'm thinking about. It's not about permission, it's not about protection. It's just about trying to take care and be thoughtful about my engagement with the public, my relationship to people. I don't need to extend that same consideration to police because they have power. So I don't have to ask a cop, like, is it okay to photograph you? You know, like that's there, he's not going to arrest himself. So that's a different relationship to vulnerability and marginalization and power. What I actually think is interesting is there have been a lot of photos that highlight Black cops specifically. And I've seen these images where, you know, the photographer's like in their face, like photographing interactions or aggressions between protesters and you know, police, police of color, essentially. And I think that there's something interesting there, because while the institution of policing itself provides a level of power and authoritarianism to all of its, you know, constituents within the police force, I would say that those Black police who are being highlighted are possibly more vulnerable. And so, you know, I don't have a good answer for this. I'm just raising it as a potential ethical consideration. I tended not to photograph police because I'm not interested in what they were doing, and everyone else was already photographing them. So I didn't feel I needed to add to the visual lexicon of what the cops were doing at protests. Instead, I was interested in what the protesters were doing and how they were, you know, relating to one another. So that wasn't an issue that I personally ran into, but I think it's something that, again, we should grapple with. We won't have the answers to everything, but I think there's value in thinking about it. There's value in talking about it. None of us is perfect. None of us will have the right answer all the time, but all of us can try to understand the complexities of our job and grapple with them. All of us are capable of that, and we should do it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a reasonable discussion to have. It's just interesting to me, the kind of anger that it raised among some photographers. It's sort of interesting to me.
It is telling. It's very telling,
Yeah.
you know. One of the things I kept saying as we saw this sort of invective coming across the socials, you know, I kept saying, well, will the real white supremacists please stand up? Because I knew from my career in photojournalism that there, you know, that there is quite a bit of sexism, that there is quite a bit of racism. I've certainly experienced it, but I really did think that that was relegated to such a small and unimportant few. I had no idea how pervasive that mentality was, how pervasive the lack of respect for the very communities that people have made their careers off of photographing, how prevalent that actually was in photojournalism. It's deeply concerning, but on another level, it is useful for people to kind of essentially stand up and raise their hand and show that they are people who don't care about the people they're photographing, who aren't willing to think about these things, and who thinks that their right to photograph supersedes anyone else's potential endangerment from their photographs. And this also really highlighted this conversation of it, or this idea of intent versus impact. And one of the things I saw someone say is, intent is all that matters. Well, that's such an interesting thing for a photojournalist to proclaim, because if intent is all that matters, then what are we actually saying about some of the world's most heinous crimes? If someone's intent via genocide was to cleanse their society of whatever thing that they've come up with, but the impact is that you're murdering people, what are we saying by it implying that whatever we hope we're doing is all that matters, and what we are actually doing doesn't have bearing on reality? That's a very strange position, I think, for any journalist to take. So I think that this controversy has been, I keep saying telling, but I think it is opening up an opportunity to talk about deeper issues in the industry than we perhaps even realized that we needed to talk about. We focus so much on the issues of diversity, but even if we fill the ranks, the newsrooms with more women and people of color, that's not going to change the sort of underlying toxicity of our thinking. If we believe that intent is all that matters and impact doesn't matter, if we believe that our rights supersede our responsibilities, and that our privilege of access to people is more important than the privilege that we are afforded by being in proximity to people's stories and being trusted with that. So there's many things to grapple with there that have become apparent, I think, through these controversies.
Yeah, that just raises all sorts of questions for me, and I'm afraid we'll run out of time. But it does feel to me like the argument on the other side is partly one of, the value of the photo to a community versus the impact on an individual, which is not quite the same as defining that as somehow racist. Or, I think that, your case that we need to take care of and think about the people we're photographing makes sense, but I do think some photographers see it as the greater good, maybe outweighing, the needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few kind of argument. And that, sure, maybe my photo is going to get that one person in trouble, but it's going to raise issues and questions that are important, at least.
Yes. Let me clarify a statement that I made. I don't mean to imply that those photographers who pushed back against the idea of informed consent were inherently racist. What I'm actually drawing attention to is some of the things that then came out of those conversations, the ways in which they spoke to or engaged with photojournalists of color, women, photojournalists. That is the space in which we came to recognize. I understand the very valid concerns of limiting press freedoms, and how, and I am always here to have that conversation about how do we balance our right to photograph in public spaces with this idea of informed consent. That's an important conversation to have. And I am completely and very verbally against blurring protesters' faces. I would never do that, and I don't think that anyone should. And I have said that far and wide, for a multitude of reasons. But what came out of, what started as a sort of controversy between to ask, to engage in informed consent or not, then led to the unveiling of these sort of underlying ideas and ideologies in photojournalism that were coming from a very white supremacist and sort of heteropatriarchal relationship to image making. And seeing how pervasive that was is what I'm speaking to as being sort of shocking and unexpected. Yeah, so I think there's a ton to unpack there, and we're running out of time. But I think the value of this conversation is in engaging it and continuing it. It's difficult, it's uncomfortable, it maybe goes against some of the things that, in one regard, it plays on this idea of permission that is uncomfortable. In another regard, it is actually just expanding on the idea of being in conversation with the people that you photograph, which we're supposed to be to get captions. And, you know, one of the things I started noticing, because then I was paying more attention to the work of the most vocal people who were coming out against informed consent, and I started noticing that they never seemed to name people in their captions, that they that their captions were actually very short and not contextualizing. And, you know, like, frankly, as a professor of photojournalism, if my students turned in those captions, they would fail the assignment. So it's interesting to see the different relationships to our job as photojournalists, and things can change. You know, I think that's where we are. We're in the space of reckoning with how we have been doing things and how we could do things. And any kind of reckoning is uncomfortable and difficult, and any kind of change, institutional change, ethical and moral change, that's all very, very difficult. It's emotional labor, you know, it's reimagining a practice that you might have been doing for a very long time. These are not things I was thinking about 10 years ago, but that's what I think about now. And that doesn't mean, you know, it's not easy for me, but it's something that I care about, so I'm going to do it. And that's all I'll ask of anyone else is, you know, please care about it, please think about it, be willing to be a little uncomfortable so that we can see if we can make photojournalism better. Maybe we'll make photojournalism great for the first time.
All right. Kurt has one last question, and then we'll kind of wrap up, because we are running out of time here, and it seems like a good place to end. So he asks, if you're a person who doesn't come from a family with generational wealth, how do you get experience when news organizations expect you to do academic unpaid internships?
Thank you for that question, Curtis. And let me tell you, that is a big part of the research that I do. I think one thing that we very consistently gloss over and do not engage with is the socioeconomic limitations to entering the photojournalistic field. Now, I mentioned in my sort of like introduction of my career in photojournalism that I started off as a writer, even though I really cared about photography, because I couldn't afford a camera. My family couldn't afford a camera. And it was a while before I was able to access that. I certainly couldn't afford unpaid internships. I was lucky enough to get paid internships. And that's what I would recommend to you. I know paid internships now have gone the way of the dinosaur in light of the 2008 kind of economic crash and media decline. But I think also the industry is changing, and the level of gatekeeping that used to be true when I was, you know, when I was coming up, you couldn't have gotten a photojournalism position if you weren't a stringer or an intern. I think now you can do personal projects. You can, you know, photograph as part of your campus newspaper. What you need is a portfolio of work. You need a body of work that speaks to your ability to do excellent visual storytelling. And you can learn that in campus media. You can learn that by doing personal projects. You can learn that by engaging with, you know, spaces like this, by reading, by you know, voraciously consuming photography and writings on photography. And if you show that, you know, that portfolio, then you'll be in a position to freelance, because, you know, the goal used to be to get that staff job. And I think that not only are staff jobs so very few and far between, I don't know that it is necessarily the coin of the realm like it used to be. And I think more people are freelancers than anything. That's how a lot of people are making money. Frankly, I make a lot more money as a freelancer than I ever did as a staff photojournalist or a staff journalist of any kind. So, however, it is hard at the beginning, and it is its own. It has its own economic issues in terms of what you can afford and what you have access to with your gear. So I don't have a great answer for you. I have a lot of empathy for that question and for that position. And I would encourage you to keep broaching that question, to keep pointing to, you know, in your classrooms, in your spaces and workshops and talks, keep pointing to the socioeconomic barriers of entering this field, because it's our responsibility as the professionals, the people in it, the educators, we need to contend with that, and we need to make this a field that anyone can get into if they, anyone who has the talent and the skill and the passion and who wants to do this job. You shouldn't be barred from becoming a photojournalist because you can't afford a $5,000 camera. So that is something we need to talk about. I don't know how useful of an answer that was, but I appreciate you and your question.
I thought that's I think a great place to end it. It was both a mix of realistic and a little bit hopeful. So maybe that's all we can expect right now.
My favorite mix. Thank you so much
great.
for having me, and thank you for everyone's questions and attention.
Really appreciate it. So thank you. Yeah, and I know you might stop in tomorrow to listen to tomorrow's talk. I hope everyone who's still here stops back tomorrow. Yeah, and thank you. Have a good night, and thank you all for sticking around.
Thank you. And also, please don't hesitate to reach out if you're a student and you want to talk more or want to connect in any way. I'm always happy to speak to fellow faculty or students. I mean, to anyone really, but extending that specific invite to the Penn State community. Thank you all again for having me. Take care.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too.
Good night, everybody.